In the dense Philippine jungles, one soldier waged a war that ended 30 years prior. However, he did not know this. His name was Hiroo Onoda, a Japanese officer who, for almost 3 decades, continued guerrilla warfare against Allied troops because he was convinced that World War II was still ongoing. The greatest military conflict in human history came to an end in August 1945. It concluded with the surrender of Nazi Germany and the subsequent surrender of Japan following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Soldiers from various countries returned home to start new, peaceful lives. However, news of the war's end did not reach everyone. Hiroo Onoda, an intelligence officer in the Japanese army, was sent to Lubang Island in the Philippines in early 1945. He was ordered to impede the enemy's advance at all costs. During the course of the war, Onoda found himself cut off from communication and, unaware of Japan's surrender, continued his guerrilla activities for another 30 years in the name of his country. Why wasn't he captured during this time, and what ultimately became of this soldier? This is an incredible yet entirely true story about a soldier lost in time. In January 1945, a young intelligence officer in the Imperial Japanese Army was dispatched to Lubang Island in the Philippines per his orders. He was to wage guerrilla warfare against Allied troops and, under no circumstances, surrender or take his own life. The command also promised to retrieve the soldiers eventually. At the time, Hiroo Onoda was 22 years old. He had just completed his military training ahead of schedule and was eager to serve his country fervently. Much of Lubang Island is covered in dense, nearly impenetrable jungles. The primary enemies of the Japanese in this location were American and Filipino soldiers. Onoda had only 3 soldiers under his command, and each had just a rifle, a few grenades, and a couple of 100 rounds of ammunition. The Japanese soldiers hid in the jungles and periodically organized guerrilla raids. Mostly they gathered intelligence as well as procured provisions and ammunition. In August-September 1945, news of Japan's surrender reached Lubang Island. Leaflets were dropped from the sky announcing the capitulation. Onoda did not believe this news, suspecting it was merely enemy propaganda to coerce Japanese soldiers into surrendering. He decided to continue his campaign, leading his men deeper into the jungles. When Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda was dispatched to Lubang Island, his orders were to carry out guerrilla resistance against American and Filipino soldiers, since the island was strategically important to the Japanese command. One of Onoda's primary tasks was to destroy the airstrip and pier in the island's harbor to prevent their use by enemy forces. However, for the most part, Onoda was given freedom in how to conduct his guerrilla resistance. One of the orders to his soldiers was to survive at all costs, to prolong the combat as much as possible. In Japanese culture, duty has always been of paramount importance. The command understood that soldiers might commit suicide if an operation failed, so one of the orders explicitly prohibited them from taking their own lives. Because Onoda was given this freedom to act, he was cut off from his immediate command, which could have informed him of the war's end. The officer was well prepared for guerrilla warfare and had received intelligence training to make strategic decisions without direct orders from his command. This only added to the young officer's sense of purpose and responsibility. Upon arriving on Lubang Island, Hiroo Onoda and his soldiers realized that survival would be a challenging endeavor. Firstly, there were the harsh conditions of the jungle, and secondly, the constant threat posed by enemy forces. The soldiers' first days were spent setting up a base in a secluded area deep within the dense jungle, far from local villages. This base served as their operational headquarters from which they could launch guerrilla raids and to which they could retreat. The group's survival also depended on their ability to find necessary resources. They foraged for food in the jungle, collecting bananas and coconuts, hunting wild boars and birds, and gathering water from streams, all while exercising extreme caution to avoid detection by enemy soldiers or local inhabitants. Onoda and his men learned to use the natural terrain for camouflage and set traps to deter anyone who might stumble upon their hideout. They could move almost silently and use the sounds of the jungle to mask their movements. Onoda established a strict daily routine, which helped maintain discipline and morale. He held regular meetings to plan strategy and ensure everyone knew their roles and responsibilities. This routine helped the soldiers focus on their mission. The Japanese soldiers meticulously maintained their weapons and conserved ammunition, unsure how long their mission would last. Indeed, it is doubtful that Onoda anticipated his mission would span 3 decades. By the end of 1945, rumors of Japan's defeat began reaching Lubang Island via leaflets dropped from airplanes. One of these leaflets included a message from Japanese military leader General Tomoyuki Yamashita, announcing the surrender of all Japanese troops. Onoda scrutinized every word, suspecting it was a clever American ploy to make them lay down their arms. He was convinced that no genuine Japanese command would surrender so unconditionally. For Onoda, the war was not over until a direct order from his superiors confirmed otherwise. But such an order never came. Onoda and his men's resolve was tested even further when a local resident approached them one day with a letter from Onoda's family, delivered through the Filipino government. His family begged him to cease combat and return home. This message gave Onoda pause, but after a sleepless night, he decided the letter was just another form of psychological warfare. Onoda and his soldiers were determined to continue their resistance, retreating further into the remote regions of the jungle. Decades passed, and the lives of Hiroo Onoda and his comrades on Lubang Island became completely isolated from the changing post-war world. Onoda's leadership was characterized by strict discipline, which he believed was necessary to maintain order and psychological balance among his men. Their daily routine consisted of survival, guerrilla raids, and patrolling. The soldiers adeptly adapted to their environment, building bamboo huts for shelter, extracting water from trees, and making clothing from bark to replace their worn-out uniforms. They also caught rats and feral cats, but their primary food sources were boiled bananas and coconuts. Sometimes they stole rice, canned goods, clothing, matches, and other supplies from nearby Filipino villages. On occasion, Onoda and his men forcibly extorted the things they needed from local inhabitants, leading the villagers to refer to the Japanese soldiers as mountain bandits. The Japanese soldiers regularly attacked the armed forces of the Americans and Filipinos, with their primary target being the Air Force Base. In the 30 years Onoda spent on the island, he carried out more than 100 guerrilla raids. During clashes with military personnel and local residents, the Japanese soldiers killed several dozen people and injured about 100. To avoid capture, Onoda and his men constantly changed their location. Every 5 days, they organized a new camp using leaves and branches for camouflage. In addition to the constant risk of being discovered by American or Filipino soldiers, the jungle itself posed significant dangers. The soldiers faced various challenges, from tropical diseases to dangerous wild animals. Communication with the outside world was virtually non-existent. Rare encounters with residents of local Filipino villages were tense and often hostile. With each passing year, Onoda and his comrades became more and more detached from reality. The soldiers frequently experienced periods of despair. The small radio they had initially used had long since stopped working, and they had no way to repair it. The American military and Filipino authorities made repeated attempts to contact the Japanese soldiers and inform them that World War II was over. Until 1946, several Japanese groups remained on Lubang Island, but all of them surrendered to local authorities immediately after Japan's capitulation. Onoda's squad was the only one that continued to resist. Because there was no communication with this group, the Japanese authorities officially declared Onoda and his comrades dead in 1946. 4 years later, in 1950, one of the soldiers from Onoda's group surrendered to Filipino soldiers and returned to Japan. This event made it clear that Onoda and his men were still alive and hiding in the deep jungles of the island. In the mid-1950s, more active attempts were made to contact the lost soldiers. The Japanese government organized search missions, sending teams into the jungle with orders to find Onoda and his men and convince them that the war had ended long ago. However, the searchers often failed to establish contact because Onoda and his men had become adept at hiding in the jungle. In the mid-1950s, another member of Onoda's squad surrendered to Filipino soldiers after being wounded in a clash. However, the fate of Onoda and one remaining comrade remained unknown. After numerous unsuccessful search operations, the Japanese government once again declared Onoda and his last subordinate dead in 1972. In the same year, on another island in the Pacific Ocean, a soldier from the Japanese army was found by chance. He too had continued fighting for almost 30 years, unaware that World War II had ended. This discovery led the Japanese authorities to realize that this soldier was likely not the only remaining Japanese serviceman lost in time. By the end of 1972, on Lubang Island, the last of Onoda's comrades was killed in a shootout. After this, the Japanese resumed their search on Lubang Island, even bringing Onoda's brother, who used a loudspeaker to call out to his brother, sharing personal family stories and recent news. However, Onoda continued to hide, still skeptical of all the pleas and proclamations he heard, believing them to be enemy propaganda. He continued to follow his orders, and the jungle became his fortress, protecting him from the changing world. With each passing year, Onoda's psychological and physical isolation deepened, especially after the death of his last comrade. One day in 1974, while observing the island from a hidden vantage point, Onoda noticed the figure of a young Japanese man. Initially, Onoda watched the newcomer from a distance, keeping himself concealed. He believed this was just another enemy trick to lure him out. The young Japanese man was Norio Suzuki, an adventurer who had learned of the lost officer and came to Lubang Island with the express purpose of finding him. Suzuki believed that if he could locate Onoda, it would be a historic event. With this in mind, the adventurer made his way through the treacherous Lubang jungle. After several days of searching, Suzuki finally encountered Onoda, who had been observing him from afar. Suzuki approached the officer, calmly introduced himself, and explained his mission. He also expressed deep respect for Onoda's unwavering service to his country over the years. It was Suzuki's respectful and understanding approach that proved pivotal. He did not argue with Onoda's belief that the war was still ongoing, allowing him to gradually establish a connection with the cautious soldier. During their conversations, Suzuki showed Onoda recent newspapers with photographs, detailing events from the past 3 decades. However, Onoda, still shackled by military discipline and skepticism, found it difficult to accept this as irrefutable proof that World War II had ended. Suzuki realized that something more was needed to convince Onoda, so he decided to temporarily leave the island, promising to return with someone Onoda could not refute, his former commander who had given the original order to resist. Norio Suzuki returned to Japan and set out to find Onoda's former commander, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi. After the war, Taniguchi had returned to civilian life and did not believe the rumors that his former subordinate was still alive and fighting. However, after much persuasion, he agreed to go back to Lubang Island to officially relieve Onoda of his duties. Accompanied by Suzuki and a delegation from the Japanese government, Taniguchi flew to Lubang Island. When Onoda emerged from the jungle and saw his former commander dressed in civilian clothes and accompanied by officials, he finally accepted that the war was over. Taniguchi presented him with official orders confirming the cessation of hostilities and his release from duty. He explained that Japan had been at peace for almost 30 years and that further service was unnecessary. On March 9, 1974, during a solemn ceremony held in the jungles of Lubang Island, Hiroo Onoda officially surrendered. Dressed in his tattered uniform that had endured 30 years of guerrilla warfare, Onoda handed over his sword, a functioning rifle, and several hand grenades to the Filipino government, which accepted his surrender and immediately released the Japanese officer, who was now 52 years old. News of Onoda's surrender spread worldwide, attracting international media attention to the small island. The story of a soldier who had single-handedly waged war for almost 30 years captured the imagination of many. Onoda himself was overwhelmed by the spirit of dedication and resilience that had sustained him. The Japanese government provided Onoda with a substantial compensation package and offered personal apologies from the country's emperor. Upon returning to Japan, Onoda struggled to adapt to a country that had changed significantly over the decades. Skyscrapers, high-speed trains, and a rapidly developing Japan were foreign to him. In search of a new life, Onoda moved to Brazil, where he raised livestock. However, after a decade in Latin America, he decided to return to his homeland. There, he founded an educational camp for young people, teaching them survival skills and the importance of discipline and responsibility. The former Japanese Army officer also wrote a memoir titled No Surrender, My 30-Year War. Hiroo Onoda lived a long life and died in 2014 at the age of 91.